Good afternoon. And I continue to be fascinated that this series somehow attracts an all-male audience. It's utterly fascinating. Okay. Hello. We were just saying that somehow this series attracts an all-male audience, so join the club. So yeah, and incidentally, rain is, as a natural element, water is supposed to be an expression of the feminine. So, yeah. So,
we are reclaiming wholeness. That is why we are coming.
Yes. Hopefully. So yeah, today's agenda is looking at how do we reclaim wholeness as one of the means of approaching the feminine in us. So we've been looking at various aspects of the feminine in this series. So initially we simply spoke about the idea of gender and how femininity has been perceived in our culture in general. And then we went on to talk about how do we start accessing the feminine within us. The last time we said that the feminine is anchored in the present, right? The feminine as an energy, as a psychic energy, it does not know past or future. It knows what is, and what is the present, and therefore cultivating our sense of presence is a very important part of accessing the feminine. It is the key to access the feminine in many ways. And once we access the feminine, access the presence, then the feminine shows up in the form of what we might call gifts, wholeness being one of it. So there is wholeness, there is flexibility, and there is congruence that comes with presence as the key. And once all of these are in shape and anchored in presence, the feminine flows through us. So all along we've also been saying that the feminine as an expression is a psychic energy, it is a spiritual energy, it is also a mental energy, as well as, of course, it's also a physical energy in the form of hormones that we all have, right? All of us have the male and the female hormones in various balances.
Only one question I want to ask you, sorry, I came here. Because when you say female energy, there is only the male part of it, or even the female part of it has that female energy?
Oh yes, all of us have male and
which
female.
Is higher and which is lower.
Yes. So all of us have both testosterone and estrogen in us. It's just that the balance varies.
But it's in the both, male and the
yes, both.
Physical part and the mental part, mental personality part.
Yeah.
What I meant to ask, because with the male part I can understand. Because femininity has certain static senses and other things. In the female also, do they enjoy the same aesthetic senses in the female energy?
Would you mean that does a woman enjoy aesthetic senses?
Because this is the question, both energies are there.
Yes.
And you have to balance the energies.
Yes.
Now it's the imbalance what we start bringing it down to
yes.
reality.
Yeah.
That is what the whole purpose is. Now when you have that, the male I can understand 100% because he would like to. He would like to because it has a certain beautiful inspiration and other things which come down to the mind. But whether female have, do they also have that, or do they enjoy the male hormone energy side of it?
No, both need to access both of it equally. Okay. See, I mean, as a woman brought up in this society and in this culture, a lot of us are trained to be very masculine in our thought processes, in our ways.
No, I agree.
Right? So, in that sense, it's not necessary that just because I happen to be biologically female, I am necessarily feminine. No, not necessarily. Okay. Not really. It's a reclamation of the feminine for both the man and the woman today. It's not really dependent on the biological sex of it. Yeah. Everybody needs to reclaim it. Because somewhere over the centuries, for some reason, humanity as a collective seems to have chosen to bury femininity. Right? If you look at historical references, this seems to go back, in many cultures, it seems to go back to what is supposedly termed the witch burnings of in Europe and a little bit in the US. In India, still continues in some forms. So that seems to be one of the historical markers. There seem to be several other historical markers. Mythologically in India, one of the markers seems to be the disappearance of the river Saraswati. The river actually went underground, and now incidentally this year they're bringing the river back, right? The Haryana government, yeah, the Haryana government somewhere figured out that the river is still flowing underneath and we need to bring it back to the surface. So in some sense there's a very physical resurgence happening of the feminine. So we're not quite sure of historically what exactly caused the fear or whatever that reason was which made humanity as a collective say that we don't need the feminine, let's bury the feminine. And for some reason now we seem to be ready, and therefore that there is that collective conversation happening. So men as well as women need to claim it.
You defined it very well.
Yes. So why wholeness? So one of the gifts of presence, as we spoke about the last time, is once we are present, once we are here and now in the moment, and there is as we said, we look at all aspects of ourselves. So in the head, in the heart, in the gut, if you're completely present, there's nothing to defend, nothing to fear, nothing to promote, then we are here and now. And in that here and now, there is that completion, there is that wholeness. And what we mean by wholeness is integration of the self. So there are many splits within us, right? So splits could be expressed in the form of what we in an earlier series we had spoken of as parts of self, right? And how do we work with parts of ourselves? So there could be an inner child, an inner parent, an inner critic, an inner enemy, all kinds of selves that we have within us. How do we heal the relationships within those, right? So that's one way of expression of wholeness. So that's at the emotional and the mental level. And of course, ultimately there is also that aspect of mending those relationships, healing those parts, but also balancing those parts in terms of consciously choosing which part is necessary when. So sometimes that critic might be needed, and therefore we need to bring up that critic very willfully, whether we like it or not, and let it have its expression. As much as we need, let's say, a warrior at times, we need a teacher at times, we need somebody to be gentle at times. Yeah. So that balance is a moment to moment decision. We can't really adopt a default position and say, okay, this is where I'll operate from, right? And the whole idea of parts work, and to a great degree the whole idea of wholeness, is about that, not to operate from a default position, right? Sometimes we take up these stances in life which are very convenient in the sense that so let's say if I've had a very traumatic incident that's happened in my life, maybe I've lost somebody very close to me, I may in a moment of defense make a choice that okay, now on I'm not going to be emotionally close to anybody ever, because that grief is too much to bear, right? So I don't want to get close to somebody and then lose the person, and that becomes a default stance, right? And therefore there is that part of me which is that warrior which is operating, and that's the only part that seems to be operating. All the other parts of me get relegated into the background, and therefore even as I operate through life, through that stance, I'm not whole. So there's just that one part of me. Yes. And usually that part, that unwholesome stance tends to occur because we are either trying to defend ourselves against grief or against anger or something like that, or we are trying to promote an agenda and therefore we have to stand for that particular agenda. Or there's something that we deeply fear and therefore we are trying to withdraw, and therefore there is that aloof part which tends to gain momentum. The idea of wholeness is to consciously choose what part needs to operate at what moment in time, and let the part relegate into the background when it's not needed, and at the same time also mend the relationship between the parts. So Carl Jung used to speak about wholeness and the feminine in an interesting way. So he started off from the psychological perspective of saying that all of us have an ego self and there's a shadow self, right? There's the persona and the shadow. Persona, the ego self being the part of us that is in the light, so to say, in the sense that is the part of ourselves that is expressed to the world. So I operate in a certain way, I behave in a certain way, I make certain kind of decision. Yeah, the masks that we wear, right? And sometimes it may be reality also. It may not necessarily be put on. It could be very much my real self. So there is that ego self. So ego not in the bad sense of the term, ego self as in the part of the self that is the persona, right? And there is the shadow self, which is unexpressed, which is the part of me that I either deliberately suppress and not allow expression, or there's a part of me that I have never encountered, right? So I don't know, right? So for example, I have so far in my life never felt the need to pick up a knife and murder somebody, right? Does that mean I'm incapable of being a murderer? No, I'm very capable of doing that. Right, so there is that aspect in my shadow. The murderer exists, the rapist exists, the terrorist exists. I have either not had the opportunity for that part of me to come up, or I have chosen not for it not to come up. Right? So there is the ego self and the shadow self, and Jung used to make an interesting statement.
Shadow, you used the term as a negative type or no?
No, not necessarily. Yeah, a lot of good parts may exist in the shadow, right? So
but not prominent. I mean,
it's just not in the light. It is not something that I have claimed, and therefore it is not something I express. So for example, if I have grown up with a history of abuse, for example, I may grow up with the persona of a victim. Right, that the world is bad to me, I need to be scared of people, I need to be careful, I need to take care of my safety, and therefore that becomes a stance, and therefore what is in my persona is the victim, right? What happens when the victim is in my persona is my power is in my shadow, right? Which is not a bad thing, power is a great thing, but it is in my shadow, so it's a very positive shadow there, right? And Jung says that till the time we bring the unconscious into the conscious, we bring the shadow into the persona, it will rule us and we will not know.
It may erupt sometime.
Yes, erupts because it needs expression, it is a part of you, right? So it is going to claim expression.
You look in the mirror and talk and you
yes, so
shadow part of it.
Yeah, so it needs expression. And it rules us in the sense that it will come up as, so if I am, let's say, playing victim in my life, the power will come up in the form of, let's say I become a mother-in-law and I start torturing my daughter-in-law, right? Just because I have had a bad phase as a daughter-in-law, right? So I'm repeating the cycle. There's no logical reason for me to torture my daughter-in-law, but I do it because I happen to have a bad phase as a daughter-in-law, and therefore my power comes into play, but it does not come into play positively. It comes into play in the form of overpowering my daughter-in-law, right? So then when the power doesn't get natural expression, it becomes power over somebody, and therefore I'm trying to dominate, I'm trying to, in relationships where, let's say, somebody is very meek or very submissive, I would seek to dominate. The power starts expressing itself.
Remembers me, I've seen two lonely ladies. One is of an attitude because of loneliness, and of course capability was there. So I don't need you attitude.
Yes.
I mean, everything I can do, I don't need support and all.
Yeah.
And another lady with a single son of an attitude that I want to express me through you. So after the marriage also, every time you have to express my presence.
Yeah.
So that kind of attitude.
Yes. It depends on what they relegated into the shadow, right? So if I'm living with the stance that I am independent, my dependency or codependency is in the shadow, right? So even when there are situations and relationships where I need to be dependent, I will try and sabotage it because I don't like that equation. And therefore the shadow governs the sabotage there.
And third party will suffer.
Well, I also suffer equally if I'm part of the play, because somewhere there's a lot of self-sabotage that happens in the play.
Daughter-in-law will suffer.
Yeah. No, even the self, in the sense, I am depriving myself of a good relationship. Right? So a lot of self-sabotage happens because the shadow governs me. Shadows, of course, also play out in our dreams. They play out in various ways through which the unconscious expresses itself. Shadows play themselves out in the form of art sometimes. Right? If I'm a painter, I would probably do a lot of what is called the dark art.
Expression.
Yeah, that becomes the mode of expression of the shadow. Right? So, of course, most of us don't live in the extreme sense of ego and shadow self, not in the form of Jekyll and Hyde, but yeah, all of us do have those parts of us which are the shadow. Yeah, I mean, the shadow is a negative term in the sense that it's associated with dark, but what is in the shadow is not necessarily bad. Sometimes a lot of our good qualities live in the shadow. Okay. So, and a lot of, at the collective level, a lot of concepts tend to live in the shadow. Right? So, if you look at India as a collective at this point, a lot of our sexuality and sensuality lives in the shadow, and therefore the expression of it is rape, and comments about what people should wear, not wear. Right? Yeah.
Last time I think we were talking before the lecture.
Yeah. So what Jung used to say was the first piece, and he calls it the apprentice piece, that the first step of wholeness is merging the ego self and the shadow self, which means claiming our shadows. Right? So claiming our shadows, that there's a lot of ways in which shadow work is done. It can be done therapeutically, it can be done simply consciously through meditation. Sometimes a lot of self-dialogue or paths work helps to understand and to simply have that conversation with self to say, okay, I could be that. Before, let's say for example, before condemning a terrorist, I could be that. Maybe if I was in those circumstances and I had those kind of choices, maybe I would have also picked up the gun, right? Is there anything about me that makes me incapable of being a terrorist? No, right? I have the brains to be one, I have the physical strength to be one, and so I could be one. And to accept that and say, it's all right, that's also a part of me. It's just that at a conscious level, I choose not to be a terrorist, I choose to be something else, right? And therefore to not stand in judgment of the terrorist.
Balancing of energy.
Yeah, because a lot of our judgment tends to create shadows. It pushes aspects of ourselves into the background because we say that is not allowed. So one way to bring about wholeness is, yeah, social fear and unconscious acceptance of the fear, right? It's not that a lot of times we have not experienced a lot of things that we fear. We fear because others say it is to be feared, right? So there's really no physical experience or tangible experience of fear in a lot of cases. It's just that we've been told. Imagination, unconscious acceptance, allowing ourselves to be conditioned. Well, it may not go into action, but sometimes it's necessary for us to just experience and say, hey, my perspective is different. Right? For example, a lot of us as children are told, don't go into a dark room, it is scary. Right? So a lot of children grow up with a fear of the dark room without actually ever having been alone in one. Right? Just the mention of a dark room somehow scares them. Does it mean something wrong will happen to the child if it simply happens to walk in a dark room? No, not necessarily. It's just a myth that gets created and we live with the myth through the rest of our lives. So a lot of those shadows are created because of the mythology we integrate into ourselves as we grow up. So while in general Western psychology has said that the path to wholeness is simply integrating ego self and shadow self, and that's it, that is psychological wholeness, that was the perspective. Jung made a very interesting comment and said, no, that's just the apprentice piece. He says the masterpiece is actually integrating the masculine and the feminine within us, which is beyond the ego self and the shadow self. So from the Jungian perspective, integration of shadow is just the first step, and then the masculine and the feminine come in later. To a great extent, the work happens also parallelly, but it is the next level of work. So there are various perspectives on wholeness. The psychological perspective, as we said, the Jungian concept of the conscious self and the unconscious self, and merging the two, the persona and the shadow, and merging the two. That's one way of looking at it. Yogic traditions speak of wholeness from the spiritual context. So in the spiritual context, in the Indian spiritual context, the terms we use are the Atman and the Paramatman, and the merging of the two. Right? The individuated self and the whole self, the divine self, and how do you blend the two. The Taoist philosophy speaks of the same idea of wholeness from the ecological perspective, in terms of how does the self be in balance with the ecology, the ecosystem around us, the yin and the yang. How do we balance that? Depending on our relationship with our environment, and therefore it is very important to consider the self in the context of one's family, one's community, country, the environment, the kind of, and how the yin and the yang balance is very dependent on the local food, the local air, the local water. All of that brings about the balance, and therefore the Taoist perspective is that of oneness, that how do we integrate self with everything, which is pretty much what all of these say, but they talk of it from various perspectives. So the spiritual perspective is oneness from the point of view of a slightly abstract concept of the soul. The Taoist philosophy speaks of it in a very physical way through the yin and the yang balance.
Yeah, concept may remain same, but only thing in different way.
Yes. So ultimately, all forms of yoga, all forms of spiritual practices speak of wholeness as the goal of the practice, that the union as the goal of the practice. In fact, the term yoga is wholeness, it's union.
Here, you are making Taoist.
Yes.
There is a Indian yang
That's also
formula.
Yes.
Indian yang formula.
that is with the ecological.
That is the oneness, the yin and the yang, the masculine and the feminine being one with each other, and therefore dancing with each other.
They say that every man is also
Yes.
female and
Dot hai.
both are.
Even the female and the male hormones in the same body.
Yeah, as you said, the yin yang symbol talks of it in terms of the black in the white and the white in the black, and therefore there is that merger that's there. The yogic tradition or the Indian spiritual tradition represents it in the form of the Ardhanarishwar, the whole. Yeah. So, there's no one way really to look at wholeness. Unlike with presence, we said we could have a simple 5-minute presence practice in it. We can center ourselves and come into the present. I find the fourfold self being a good framework for wholeness. How we work it is really an individual choice. So it's just the broad framework that I have to offer. So Brian Skeer spoke about the fourfold self in a certain context.
Who's Brian?
Brian Skeer. So he spoke of the psychologist. He also mythologist. He speaks of it from a multiple perspectives. So Skeer's original model was about the self being at the center of the logos, mythos, eros, and thanatos. So eros being the life-giving force, the creative force within us. The thanatos being the force of death within us. The destruction, not in the bad sense of the term, destruction that is needed.
Decay.
Like how the erotic force in us makes cells grow. Cells regenerate in our body every day, right? That's the erotic energy in us. The thanatos energy is what makes the cells die every day as well. And both are equally important, because if the cells don't die, then there's cancer. And so there needs to be a balance of that, and the wholeness is about integrating both and not having a preference for one over the other. So Skia speaks about the self being at the center of these two forces, the forces of creation and destruction, and the world around us, which is based on our mythos, our mythology, my myth about what my story of life is, and the logos, the logic, the rationale that rules the world. So, and each of these have different perspectives on the self, and each of these are equally important. My mythos, my myth about what my story is important, because that forms my identity. That is how I know I am, and I know who I am and what I am. Right? That's my story. At the same time, there is a logos, there is that higher perspective that talks of why I am. Right? So, the why is as important in terms of I am, yes, and I am this, and I am this because I have a purpose in life. There is a reason I was born, there is something I need to do in the world, and in order to be able to function in the world through my story and through the larger perspective,
Tangible
I
and
need to
intangible
embrace.
well, that is
It's not necessarily tangible. It's
because here we cannot say exactly stuff, but there we can show.
so if you look at
Achievement may be there. Here,
No, achievement would be down. The upper would be the higher self.
see, it's about Devat Patnaik speaks of it in an interesting way. He says the Indian perspective of mythos is a lot about the cyclicity of life, right? I mean, if you look at the general Indian mythology, there is that sense of cyclicity around the multiple incarnations of gods and multiple things recurring. There's a certain pattern of mythology in terms of the good killing the bad and all of that, right? So there is a cyclicity about it. The logos tends to look at it from the larger perspective and say, hey, what's the larger, why are we doing all of this? Why are we doing all of this?
Achha, okay, purpose.
So there is that story of Bharat, King Bharat, right, after whom Bharat, the name comes in. So there is that story of how Bharat seems to at some point believe that he's conquered the world, and therefore he wants to go and hoist his flag on Mount Meru, which is supposed to be at the center of the world. So his mythos is, I have conquered the world and therefore I have to go on top of that mountain and hoist my flag. And when he goes up there, he realizes there are thousands of flags already hoisted there, right? And the logos comes in to say, hey, this is reality. This was your myth. This is reality, right? And yet, does the reality downplay your myth? No. Your belief and your story and your life is as true. Right? And therefore, you need to continue to embrace eros, you need to continue to use the creative force of life to do what you need to do, and yet let go of what needs to be let go of.
Maybe I may be wrong. In companies or the corporate perspective, this will be my vision and mission, and that is the moment of truth when customer gives feedbacks.
That's the word out.
Word out.
Yeah. So Skia speaks of it from the perspective that in order for the self to be whole, you need to stay at the center of this. I can't only live in my story. I can't only be creative, I can't only be destructive, and I can't only be rational, logical, I can't be a robot. So therefore I need to stay at the center of all of this in order to be whole. I need to be able to access all my faculties at once, every time and any time.
Sister, in way for exploration for self, in philosophical state, the self is neither man nor woman.
Yes.
It is just like a life.
Yes.
So there is no feminine nor masculine.
Yes.
He said,
Yeah.
who am I? I have to question for that, who am I?
Yes.
Then the answer for self comes.
Yes. Yes, so the idea of self is very agender. There is no male, female to it. It is what it is. Right? It is consciousnness in simple.
More consciousness.
Consciousness with the unconscious integrated into it. So it's both ways. So Skia speaks of it from this perspective in terms of where are we living? Are you living in your midst? Are you living too much in your creative force? Are you living too much in the destructive force? Are you living too much in the logos? And the attempt towards wholeness is constantly striving to be at the center of the game. So the fourfold self adapted in a different way for wholesomeness, in a simple way if you were to use it in terms of paths work, is to stay at the center of the inner parent, the inner child, and the inner man and the woman. And how do you stay at the center of all of that, to integrate the woman in me, the man in me, the mother and the father in me, and the child in me? How do I put it all together at once every time? Because again, as I said earlier, the default stance we adopt a lot of times is usually of one of these, right? So if my identity is of a man, then I'm a man all the time, and therefore I fail to access the woman in me or the child in me, or I don't allow myself to have fun like a child or be serious like a parent. I am a man because I'm told I'm a man, right? Or any of those identities. Sometimes we are too much parent or too much child, and in that we lose the energy of all the others. So, so the fourfold model is very pliable, and we can adapt it in multiple ways. If you look at even another aspect of this would be if
transactional analysis they have taken from this part.
No, it's not derived from it, but yes, you can use the same model to look at TA as well. So to look at the parent, child, and the adult as man, woman, masculine and feminine. You can adapt the model to that. Yet another expression of it from the feminine perspective, or in fact a similar aspect to this, is the archetype of Lakshmi, the goddess Lakshmi.
Shiva and
is Lakshmi in herself is expressed in these ways in terms of the four things. So there is the Kama, Moksha, there is Dharma, and the Artha. So that's again one way of expression where Lakshmi is considered whole because of those four aspects of Dharma, Artha, Kama, Moksha. Right? So the idea of purpose, the Dharma as to why I am here, right? The Artha, the value, the wealth that I bring, not necessarily money, but wealth in terms of what I have to contribute, my service to the world. The Kama in terms of what do I desire to create, and the Moksha in terms of what am I willing to let go of in order for this whole thing to sustain. And to be at the center of this is to be Lakshmi, to be whole. So there are multiple ways in which you can play around with the model. So my invitation would be in terms of claiming your wholeness and for you to be able to share this with others. Look at it from various contexts and look at what is the foundation? What's the base? What's the mythos? What is governing you? The conditioning, the rationale, the society, whatever. You know,
then this aspect, various part of our life we can use this relationship,
yeah.
career.
Yes, absolutely. So if I were to look at myself as a professional and claim wholeness in the professional space, for example, if I have to put myself at the center of it there, what's my basis, what's my identity as a professional, what do I believe I am, right? That's in the base of it. What is my organization, my business, my boss, the world around me, the professional world around me, right? My customers, my stakeholders of all kinds, and my performance or my passion perhaps. And can I be at the center of all of that, right? Or am I veering too much towards one of those? Am I veering too much towards, let's say, professional pressure from the organization that there are rules, regulations, things to be followed, and in the process therefore I lose out on my passion, I lose out on my, what I enjoy about work, right? Or am I too much in my own story about how I am good and my boss doesn't know me and my boss doesn't identify how good I am? And in that story, am I losing out on the opportunities that I have with my stakeholders, with my customers, with my peers? So, can I stay at the center of that game? And therefore, keep claiming wholeness. It's not a steady state. It's something like presence. You need to willfully bring yourself.
How can I balance
back.
all?
Yeah. So how can I stay at the center of my story, myself, at any given point in time in a willful, conscious manner? That's the idea of wholeness. And once we do that in all aspects of our life, we invariably integrate the masculine and the feminine along the way, because the feminine energy is about the creation, it's about the passion and the flow, and the masculine energy brings in the control that is needed, the discipline that's needed for it, the rigor to be able to sustain it. That the masculine brings that in. So an attempt to be able to bring in wholesomeness will automatically inculcate the feminine and the masculine both within us. So that's a broad framework that I have in terms of wholeness. And why wholeness? Well, because the feminine flows in the wholeness. And the masculine holds as she flows. As the bank holds the river, the river flows in a productive way. If the bank's big, there's a flood. So hence that wholeness is a very necessary part of the feminine.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Actually, this I don't know.